We're going to get started. Maybe someone could place a call to Council President Reamer's office and see if he's going to join us.
You know, if we could have a light switch.
And you might, I don't know, just so we know if Mr. Berliner is going to join us as well. But let's go ahead and get started. I really want to congratulate our staff, Carolyn and Linda. I think this memo is very well laid out. A lot of thought went into it. These are complex issues, and I think that staff has laid out a very clear sense of direction for us to pursue. In addition to the memo, which we will go through point by point, there are a few other things that have come in that I would like us to discuss today, and I do want us to spend some time on the procurement issues so members can really get their heads around those. So I would envision this meeting with the agreement of my fellow chair, if she's comfortable. We ought to approve the draft resolution that staff has given us. We ought to talk about options for how these issues might be addressed in the future, and I think get those on the record. We should really understand the procurement issues and how we can address some of the complaints that we've been getting from nonprofit service providers, and I see Ms. Branson's here. Excellent. And I would like to discuss the memo on indirect costs that Leslie McDonald sent us, and I would like to discuss the message that we received from Linda McMillan, where it was observed that with respect to helping people avoid eviction and prevent homelessness, we're scattering money all over the place. And just in broad terms, I don't want to call out any particular recipient of that money. I do think it's worth spending a little time on the question of whether that kind of thing should be centralized in county government, or whether there may be benefits to having small amounts of money available all over the community from different service providers. It's not immediately clear to me which is the better approach, so we should discuss that. So that's what I would envision doing for about the next hour, if that's agreeable with colleagues, and Mr. Reamer's here, and if Mr. Berliner joins us, we'll be happy to see him, and he will not be joining us. That's all right. Okay, so let us, I don't think it's necessary to read through what we've already agreed to. I think what we ought to do is first take up the draft resolution, which needs to get out right away. So Carolyn is nodding very vigorously. I'm not sure who to call on, but if Carolyn would like to begin by describing staff's recommendation, which begins on circle 1.
Okay. Actually, we have one more item to discuss that's related to resolution, which is on page 2, in the middle. This is the
Oh, yes.
under FY.
Well, let's start with that. That's great.
You wanna start that? Okay.
So for the last several years, I mean, maybe more than 10 years, we've been indicating to the community that our top priority for community grants, that the county council's top priority for community grants, were proposals for safety net programs and services that assist disadvantaged county residents. We're near the bottom of page 2. And in our last meeting, there were 2 topics that are very timely and very urgent, and that we might want to let the community know that we're entertaining creative proposals in those areas, and those were racial equity and climate change. Is it the sense of the Joint Committee that we should let the community know that we're soliciting grant proposals in those areas? And let me just yield to the chair of the GO Committee for any comments she wants to make generally.
Sure. I mean, in terms of general comments, I think that, we're all on the same page in terms of how to proceed. Specifically, with this particular proposal, the only question I would have is that when we say, if we were to agree to include, for example, racial equity and climate change, under racial equity, what exactly would that be? Because obviously the goal would be for whatever we do, obviously, and we're going to be working on this next year, is that everything is being seen through this lens, and we're including things like, addressing issues of inequities, addressing issues of cultural proficiency, and things like that. So I guess my only question would be, if I'm a grantee and I see this, what is it that as a grantee would be seeking to propose, or what would my proposal be? What would be some examples?
So for the racial equity discussion, it's actually a little early to launch that part of our proposal. And the reason why is there's two different ways to look at the racial equity discussion in terms of community grants. I've met with Elaine about this. One, there's the issue of equity on the types of organizations that apply for funds. And second is the populations that those organizations serve. And with that, you would need metrics on both ends that have been vetted and approved. So I think it would be early to request on that something specific on the organization, saying that we are going to choose organizations based on how equitable they are in the populations that they serve. But I think we're on our way to do that. In terms of equity in the types of organizations that apply, we're actually addressing that through our last discussion before, which is to allow reviewers to review proposals based on size, organizational budget, and also geography. And I think that will help. It's not specifically under a racial equity lens, but it does help on equity in terms of size of organization or populations that they serve.
Okay, so I appreciate that clarification, and I do agree that I think it's a little bit early. We are going to engage in a very deliberative process next year to work towards this equity policy. And I guess I would just be a little bit concerned of us getting ahead and not being able to fully, I think, describe and or engage and really achieve our goals. So that was my only bit of just concern around specifically asking for that. Thank you.
So, just to clarify, was it staff's thinking that we would not solicit proposals from nonprofit providers that address racial equity, rather that the guidance that the community gets would indicate that racial equity will be one of the criteria used in determining who gets the grant?
In future years. So the idea is that because the report came out this year and we're already engaging in discussions for each of the policy areas in the council side on how we can use this as part of our policy decision-making process, we wanted to bring it up. We didn't want to lose the opportunity in this discussion to bring up that it's important that every process be looked at with this lens, and community grants is not exempt from that. So we've already started the discussion with our racial equity working group, and the first discussion that we talked about, which was, is it an issue of equity of the type of organizations and who runs them, or is it is it also an equity on the populations that all the organizations, whoever they're run by, serve? So I think we're on our way to that, and it's something that we want to bring up in our training workshops, is that everything is going underneath that type of review, this process included.
All right, let me throw out a hypothetical. Over the years, Identity Inc. not Identity Inc., Impact Silver Spring. Over the years, Impact Silver Spring has hosted discussions of privilege, of racial equity, of a whole range of topics around that theme. And I'm not in a position to assess the value of those efforts, and I don't know if any of them were grant funded. I don't know how they were funded. But I know that Impact Silver Spring is very involved in that. So would that be the kind of thing that, I'm asking my colleagues, that we would like to foster? Would we like to see community groups, not just that one, having dialogues on these topics, or engaging in training on implicit bias? Or, I mean, are these things that we would want the nonprofit community to be taking on? Because it takes place now. Again, I mentioned Impact Silver Spring because they've been very active in that space. So I'll throw it open to my colleagues. Let me call on the council president first.
Thank you. First, I just want to make an observation. It occurs to me, but I'd like to know if my colleagues would agree. We really focused the grant program on that safety net principle. I think especially during the fiscal crisis, when we had no money and we were even cutting safety net programs in the base budget. And it may in some way have contributed to the fact that there are so many grants being provided that really should be in the base budget, because they're for core services that we really know the county values and wants to do. I think as long as we're sort of matching our vision of we want to continue to meet these needs, but we're shifting that to the base, it does leave lots of room within the grant program to add additional priorities and not feel like we're walking back from our commitment to the safety net or to safety net needs. And we're not trying to do that, and we wouldn't do that. But we can make room within the grants program for more.
Could I
So-
interject?
Sure, that's how I'm getting comfortable with this delicate topic,
Yep.
but if you'd like to interject, that'd be great.
I think that's really optimistic. I don't think the overall size of the budget increases at all.
That's exactly.
So I think that, if we move things into the
well, yeah.
base, that does not necessarily assume that there's more free money for more new grants. There's only so much money.
That's a good point. I guess, I think that's a good observation. I think the more important point is just that we're not saying that we're going to be spending less on safety net programs. So whether there is truly room to add new program areas, that will depend on resources available. I guess that's a good observation. As for the topics, I kind of liked what I was hearing about how racial equity be applied is more of a lens to evaluate all applications and who they are serving, as opposed to specifically funding programs that are on that topic of racial equity. Which isn't to say we wouldn't also fund such a program. It might be we find that such a thing is compelling, but I would look at a racial equity lens biasing us towards programs that are targeted at needs, that are strongest. So I don't know that I would necessarily want to see a preponderance of applications pouring in. We're essentially pushing every group to, do programs that they weren't planning to do on that topic, as opposed to saying, how can I ensure that my programs that I provide are meeting the goal of promoting racial equity, which I think is what we're more seeking. And on the topics, we can constrain ourselves to this one now, or I'll throw it out and we can park it for later, but we have funded many important programs for after-school and summer camp, kind of whether wraparound services or educational support. And on the one hand, I'd love to see that in the base budget. On the other hand, I don't know if it will be or not. And I think we ought to continue to encourage that and do that. And I think there's been some programs, think of, the Girls Who Code, like that are helping to kind of break ground with how we do STEM education. Like, I think we want to encourage that. And generally speaking, I don't know if it's sort of just innovation and education, or if it's more narrowly tailored, it's STEM. But I think we have supported a lot of great programs, and I think we could do a lot more, frankly. I think the whole connection between school and the workforce is just a big area where nonprofits have a lot to bring to the table, and we ought to really open the door to that. So I would like to see that we have an appeal to groups to develop programs in that area.
Mr. Rice?
Sydney was.
So, I think that what the council president was trying to say, that I kind of agree with, is that what we don't want to see is, although we are promoting a shift of some of these services that are being provided by grantees to our base budget, that we would still have a robust grants program to fund innovation. So I do see, while Councilmember Leventhal, I agree with you that, we have finite resources, and I know that our next council president is going to be shepherding us through that. I also think that we do want to be aggressive in terms of, and flexible with the financing that goes with being innovative with some of the things that we're trying to accomplish. And so from that perspective, it is my hope that while I think overall, if we accomplish what we want to accomplish, we may see the grants number go down. I would hope that it's not significant, as we still know that we want to try and promote that innovation that's happening in our community. We know the basics. We know the basic things that need to happen. And I'm not just picking and choosing them because they're my favorites. It's just that we all know them and they're in the room, like Interfaith Works and MCCH and all those folks and college tracks. And all. I mean, those are folks who've been doing the same thing forever. Our Jewish Federation for Group Homes, and all these folks have been doing the same thing over and over again for years and years and years and years and years. And why we continue to put them through the grant process makes no sense to me. Those are things that have become core services and should be aligned in the base budget. But that being said, it also does not mean that we therefore just say, well, all that's in the base budget, and so our grant budget is reduced by that same amount. I think that there still needs to be a focus, and so that would follow with money, a focus on innovation to continue to be creative. Now, again, those numbers will be smaller because they're not going to be as large as we look for more innovative grants. So it's going to be a little bit different in terms of its dynamic. But I do think, and I think that's what you were trying to allude to, Council President, and so I see us there. I'm not sure what those right numbers are at this point, and obviously it's going to be up to our county executive and our Council President working together to try and help craft something that will work for us. But I really do think that there's a medium point. There's a middle ground that's there when it comes to those kinds of things. So that's, I just wanted to comment on that part for right now. I'll have more comments later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So again, just to frame where we are, I'm going to call on Mr. Katz in a moment. We have a short time frame whereby we need to get whatever version we agree to of the resolution that staff has drafted started on Circle 1. We've got to get that introduced before the full council right away, Tuesday, and then it has to be adopted right away, 2 weeks later. So to the extent that we can, at this part of the conversation, focus on what is the language that we want to include there, that's where we are in the discussion right now. So whether we still like this kind of relic language, as Mr. Reamer correctly said, that came from the recession years where the safety net was very much on our minds, perhaps that is still where we think you should concentrate limited resources. Perhaps it's not. I've never loved the term safety net, so it doesn't ring with me quite as much. The rest of it, I agree, services that assist disadvantaged county residents, yes. And then do we want to broaden that to include these other topics or other topics that may come up in this conversation? That's where we are in the conversation right now. Mr. Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First off, to the point of the base budgets, I agree with the chair that just because you put something in a base budget doesn't mean you have more money from that. It's all coming from the same pot in some ways. So we have to be careful with that. But we also need to make certain that if we can change the way that we do grants, that if we can go to a 2-year program, if we can go to that the county executive and the county council work in a different way to have money assigned to it, that it's not necessarily the county executive's money or the county council's money, it's our money, it's to work together. And even though you might have, at the end of the day, less in some cases, you certainly could have a larger amount of people or amount of organizations that would be benefiting from it. I do think that it's premature to talk about some of these, the way we do for the racial equity and we need a more of a background. But I also think it's necessary to put people on notice, to let these organizations know that that's something that we're going to look for, that they should be thinking about that now, that they should actually, in many cases, I believe they are doing it, and I think they should let that be known. It's almost like not a marketing, but it's that type of thing. But I also believe that we need to make sure that we are flexible. I don't think that we should say that we are just looking for this. I think the way you get innovation is that you don't tell somebody how they should be innovative. You let them show you how they should be innovative. So I believe in many ways, the grant process needs to be changed, and in many ways, I think we're about to do that. Thanks.
So
So my light is on.
go ahead, Ms. Novato.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm glad that we clarified the racial equity lens because it's not ready for prime time. I mean, obviously, as I said, we're going to spend the whole entire next year working on that. I do agree that it's time to give a little bit more guidance to, this next round. I would be very interested in continuing the disadvantaged, residents, broad area. But I do think that things like, after-school programs that serve disadvantaged or disconnected youth, especially those that may not be eligible for extracurricular activities through MCPS, that is something that I find to be important. The connection of, education, workforce, after-school extracurricular activities, also seniors. I do agree that I think that, the grants process allows for our partners in the nonprofit organizations to provide the type of support and services that we may not be so good at doing because maybe there's more trust with a nonprofit organization, et cetera. So those populations, again, that may not necessarily be part and already be participating, like, the youth that I described, we heard from many of them last night. There's definitely a need for more activities, that the, positive activities that can be engaging. I think that, even some of the youth talked about, what if there were more opportunities for students to come together and get to know each other better, that might reduce some of the bullying that's happening, right? So I feel like that's the point of having these forums, is to hear from our residents and our constituents, what do you need out there? And perhaps this is a way to respond to that. So that's what I would support, is for us to then give a little bit more guidance around, what are some innovative programs that are targeting these, youth that we heard from last night, that they were speaking on behalf of, and also some of our seniors that might be very isolated, might need more support, et cetera. What could be some really cool, innovative strategies that our nonprofit organizations can bring forth and we can support? So that's just from my point of view, what I think we should do. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Rice, I guess is your light on? Did you want to speak?
No.
Mr. Reamer, there's a light on your side.
on me.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, so again, we need to give staff clear guidance as to what we're going to tell the community we're looking for. My own preference is that we not use the phrase safety net programs, if people are amenable to that. I don't think it's actually all that descriptive, and it's a somewhat repetitive if you're saying services that assist disadvantaged county residents, which I do like. And I heard the council vice president go on to talk about after-school programs, especially for disadvantaged students, and programs that affect seniors. Is there agreement to those points? Okay. And is there agreement that we are not going to mention racial equity anywhere in this document? Is that the sense of the joint committee? Mr. Katz?
I don't know that we shouldn't not mention it at all. I think that, like I was saying, to put people on notice, but we don't know exactly what that's gonna be, but let them think about it. Let them help us figure this out.
Okay, I heard Ms. Novato say that topic was not ready for prime time. Ms. Novato?
Right, I was referring to what Carolyn described, that, the conversations that have taken place have been around the fact that there's gonna be all this work that's gonna, take place next year. There will be some other things that will be required, I think, after we're done with a piece of legislation. But I don't disagree that it's important to keep, we've done this before, to keep reminding folks about issues of, racial equity, cultural proficiency. I think this is something that we have already said we wanted to do. But be very specific, because like I said, I was a little bit confused, in terms of what are we asking for? Are we asking for organizations that provide this training, or, so just a little bit more description around that we are seeking organizations that are culturally proficient, are working towards, issues of, how are you working towards advancing racial equity through your services, things like that. So it just has to be described a little bit better, yeah.
So the applications would be favorably viewed if they make it clear how the grant outcome could advance racial equity.
Yeah.
Okay, so you would include language to that effect, Ms. Novato?
Yeah.
In the resolution, okay. And what about climate change? Mr. Reamer?
I don't have a specific. I don't have a specific response on that. I mean, I can't. I don't recall hearing from a lot of nonprofits that would have sought county grants, but felt that they weren't embraced by what we were offering, but maybe. But I wanted to suggest a program that maybe helps with that, I don't know, but I'm thinking of a nonprofit that has a vision for a program that could be ultimately self-sustaining, that is an innovative program, that has potentially revenue sources identified, doesn't necessarily match up with any named area, but a grant of a 1-year or 2-year grant might help propel it to self-sustaining, a large self-sustaining program. And I think it would be terrific to be open to proposals on any topic that are truly accurately positioned as taking innovation to scale or making an innovative program sustainable or something like that. Just to really have an open door to the nonprofit sector to approach us on any type where they can really persuade us that our particular investment, is being leveraged and is a temporary investment on its way to a sustainable program.
So what the language that we've been using simply says is that the council is particularly interested in safety net and disadvantaged populations. It doesn't say we are only interested, so it doesn't preclude any topic. Do you have, well, as to Mr. Reamer's suggestion then, does the joint committee want to see language to that effect that would enable an innovative proposal to get to scale? Is there support from other council members for that proposal?
Well, I think I heard the self-sustaining. In essence, it would be, so right now, as you know, there's no limit to the number of times somebody can apply for a grant. And so it sounded like what you were saying is that a grant proposal that has a commitment to a plan for being self-sustaining without county funds would be something that would be of interest. Is that, did I hear
Yeah.
that correctly?
Yes, that was part of also a general sort of rhetorical encouragement that if you've got something you think is very innovative, very different, very new, meeting something, a need that is not being met, we want you to come in
And they can,
but a condition of it is that it is, on its way to sustainability also. We're not interested in, new thinking about ideas, but clearly you don't have a real plan to make that program independent as well.
Okay, should we formally move that and second it and see if council members want to do that?
Can I ask a question?
Ms. Novak?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that gets me to thinking about the fact that, is that something we ask most organizations? Not so much the fact that we want you to be totally sustainable, but, this notion of leveraging private funding or showing, is that part of the application? Okay, because I just want to make sure we're aligned with our thinking around, wanting to leverage other resources and also moving towards, quality, scalability, sustainability, which I think, I'm not opposed to including climate change in this. I think that obviously, I think we have other programs, but I do believe that it aligns with what we've been talking about so much. And then perhaps having some kind of language that talks a little bit more about this issue of, becoming sustainable. I'm not opposed to that, but just want to make sure that everybody else understands that what we're trying to do is leverage other resources and not just have this be the only source of, of funding for these programs.
Okay, Mr. Katz followed by Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not opposed to that as well. Obviously, climate change is extremely important, and it's something that we need to be working on. But I do get concerned about the term self-sustaining. If an organization that is trying to get to be self-sustaining, and rather than be 80% dependent on government funding, if they become 30%, they're still not self-sustaining, but they're doing what I always like to refer to as the government's good work, but not having to have all taxes take care of it. So I think we could almost say, rather than self-sustaining, less dependent. Because I think that could be important. If an organization says, look, I'm never gonna get to 100% for, you know, to be completely self-sustaining, I mean, they're a nonprofit organization. So I do believe that we should work towards being less dependent, but I don't know that we necessarily have to have a group that says that they're absolutely not going to be asking the government for any funding.
Mr. Rice?
Yeah, so I agree with what Councilmember Katz just said. I think that, again, working towards something, but the true meaning of self-sufficiency and what that definition entails is not something that I think a person could either promise or say that would be attainable. I mean, you just never know what other sources of funding are going to come in and those kinds of things. So I think that a goal of getting towards some sort of sufficiency makes complete sense. I do want to address the climate change issue, because I think that we use that word, we also use environmental sustainability, and so I just want to be very careful about what it is. I just think about, there's, you know, a group that, again, they just happen to be in the room, but LAYC Conservation Corps, who does work surrounding just that, and whose work is not only about making sure that, you know, at-risk youth attain their GED, but also then into the workforce. And oh, by the way, their work is in environmental sustainability, whether it's working through stream restoration or stormwater management or whatever the case may be. So from that perspective, that again goes to then speak to climate change and addressing that issue. So do we want to be generic in that statement of saying climate change? Do we want to say more specifically about environmental sustainability? And again, I'm not trying to wordsmith too much, but I just want to make sure that we're being careful about, because some may not draw the distinction between a conservation corps and climate change versus, you know, a group who is dealing with climate mobilization, like the climate mobilization group. So.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've got some thoughts on that. So again, just to focus the conversation, what we're talking about now is on Circle 2, page 2 of the resolution, sentence 3. And we're giving a lot of guidance to staff, and so staff is going to rewrite that paragraph 3 and presumably vet it with members before we introduce it Tuesday, just so the joint committee can say, yeah, that's what I was talking about. You know, I'm not going to be here next year, but I was here all this year, and just hearing the conversation, you know, and what's on council members' minds, it strikes me that you know, we've passed this resolution declaring a climate emergency. We got this report the other day that lays out how people's behavior is going to have to change. There's going to have to be, you know, significant changes in utilization, in transportation patterns, in composting, in, you know, waste reduction, all of these issues. And I have no idea, just as Mr. Reamer said, we can't sit here today and say, I know all the innovative things that are going to come down the pike that I've never seen before. By definition, we haven't seen them before, so we don't know what they'll be. But I could envision efforts in the community to, you know, encourage composting, or, you know, even in lower income communities, you know, to get people to change their transportation patterns, or to, you know, purchase different vehicles. I don't know what it would be, but, you know, it's gonna take a broad community effort, and there may be creative nonprofits out there that are able to give us models that we could assess outcomes and, you know, see if they're valid. So I think that I think there is value in broadening what we're looking for beyond the very narrow language that is in paragraph 3 right now. I think that's extremely narrow, and I don't think, and I agree with Mr. Reamer, I don't think that our heads are where they were in 2008. I think we're in a different place. And so I would be amenable to including that as one of the topics that the council is, and it's accurate, very, very concerned about, and looking for creative approaches to solving. Mr. Reamer. And I'm sorry, just last point. So in response to Mr. Rice, should we talk broadly about environmental sustainability, or should we talk about climate change? I would actually talk about greenhouse gas reduction. I mean, I'd make it more specific rather than broader. Obviously, if someone comes in, you know, like the Conservation Corps or like LAYC, that is involved in environmental sustainability work, none of this language in sentence 3 is going to preclude a good idea that isn't contained in paragraph 3. But I mean, I guess my own preference would be that it's really focused on greenhouse gas reduction. But that would just be my view. Mr. Reamer.
What if we position it as supporting the programs identified in the climate mobilization report, or that are part of that. So like, we're essentially inviting groups to pick those really high priority initiatives and figure out how to advance them.
Okay.
I mean, it's exactly what you've said, but it just helps people
Yeah.
understand what we want them to do a little bit better.
Okay, so do we have any more guidance for staff as staff prepares a new draft of paragraph 3? Or shall we move on to the rest of the discussion? Okay, are there any other, and I'm asking staff now, are there any other decision points that we need to make before we forward this resolution to the full council?
Yes, one more. This is on page 3 of your packet, in the middle, in bold. If the joint committee council agrees they want to revisit the grants process with the incoming executive, council staff recommends that the council's resolution should state that this may happen.
Oh, I'm definitely in favor of that. Yes?
Sure, you sure?
Yeah,
Page 3 in the middle.
Mark on my one.
yeah.
Page 3 in the middle, bold, if the joint committee council agrees that you want to revisit the grants process for FY '20, so this upcoming year with the incoming executive, we recommend that we state this in the resolution.
Yes, I'm seeing a great vigorous nodding of heads here.
All right.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there other decisions before the joint committee regarding the language of the resolution to be introduced on Tuesday?
Nope, we're good.
Okay, all right, excellent. So, so now, again, I think that this memo is very well laid out, and it addresses a lot of serious issues. What do we need to decide today with respect to the council staff recommendations for FY '21?
Well, I would say that we've put in several discussion items for you regarding thoughts on 21 and beyond. And I would say that from council staff's perspective, we strongly wanted the joint committee to at least start to consider whether the community grants process should be substantially changed. And in council staff's view, potentially the specific grant award process could be moved out of this time frame of, just in those budget months. And so there are of course many other issues that could go along with that we've talked about even a couple years ago. Do you want to limit the number of years people can apply? Do you want to limit the number of applications? All those are sort of smaller things. But I think that the biggest structural thing, which was brought up in the OLO report, are these other models where the process comes out of the very specific budget process. And so I think that if that would be the thing I think we would think is most important for the start of the committee discussion. Obviously, is this something that has to be discussed with the new executive? But for example, if you look at a process whereby the executive and the council determine, just as you do frankly with some of the grants that go outside right now, right? You determine the total amount of money that's going to be in that grant program. You have priorities around it. And in a case of like a McHale, it's very specific. You know exactly, you're giving them a set amount of money. They're going to have a grants process for this specific purpose. But they don't do it, they don't have to complete that by, July 1st. They can have that over the course of the year. Yep. And in the case of a broader grants program, as we have now, this would also help to manage the number of grant applications, because right now, as you know, we have hundreds of grant applications coming in for many different purposes, but you all have named some very good purposes. And if the actual grants award process could be set up outside the budget process, for example, you could have a process that's set up for summer programs whereby the decisions could be made in November or December so that the organizations providing summer programs would know that they will have their contracted money well in advance of the summer, right? So, and that would also help just to ease the administration of the grants program as it works. So I think we've listed out, many points here, but that's, I think, one of our big discussions is whether the council is interested in really restructuring. I think that the one piece that, if we do that, we would have to think also about a little bit is the cost-sharing grants. Oftentimes, you get those, they're tied to not always, but often they're tied to a bond bill, which you hear about during budget, and then you make a decision. That may be
Yep.
a process that still stays in
Right.
the budget months, right? That cost-sharing piece. But that's a small piece of the number of grants that you're talking about. And
Those
so-
aren't even reviewed by the Grants Advisory Committee.
They are not.
I know.
Right. So I think that in terms of the largest issue, this would be the largest issue that we would want you to discuss. And of course, the OLO report had information about Fairfax and some other jurisdictions and ways that they do it to change that. So I would just say that's probably the biggest thing in the packet for discussing what happens in '21 and beyond. Because if you're going to do that, then you really do have to start that process sooner rather than later, because the organizations need to understand how the timing will change and how the process will change so that they can do their financial planning as well. And so I think if there's interest in a really substantial change in the process, it's something that you can't wait, right? When the new executive comes in, you're going to have to start these discussions, frankly, probably in January and February for what you're going to do in '21,
Yep.
let alone revisiting FY '20.
So I'll speak for myself. I'm really happy with this memo. I really like the thought that went into it, and I'm broadly supportive of all the initiatives that are proposed in it. I think that the grants process should be substantially revamped and substantially depoliticized. And let me just say a word about that. It has always been my view, and I've been in the minority sometimes on this, and I've certainly have not been in agreement with the incumbent county executive on this, that the political credit that an elected official gets by awarding grants pales in comparison to the much larger number of people who don't get grants and who are disappointed. So I have never believed, not in the arts and humanities and not in the community grants, that there was a political upside of making sure that the recipient knows that you gave them that grant that outweighs the reality that we have a huge amount of needs chasing a limited amount of resources, and there's never enough to go around, and you're always going to be fielding complaints no matter what you do. And the more you, as the elected official, put your thumbprint on it and make it appear that you are the one responsible, I think you open yourself up for more political detriment than political benefit. That's always been my view. I know that our esteemed county executive has exactly the opposite view, so that's all right. But anyway, I'll yield to other council members.
I think it's different for a county executive a little bit than it is for the council, because the truth is no one council member is supposed to get the credit of a grant, and but that's quite different when you're the executive sending over a lot of grant requests. So that's also the way I see that. But I actually do agree that you don't. I mean, we're just talking raw politics here. Like, it's not. Council members will live happier lives, and it won't affect them one bit to have a process that does not require them to get into this conversation with untold organizations. And provided our policy goals are being achieved, I think it'll just be a healthier, happier community of organizations and their elected officials.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way, Mr. Reamer, that, and I do too, and it has not always been the view of a majority of council members, and that would be a substantial shift if a majority of council members felt that they no longer wanted to have the ability to respond to an individual organization appealing to that council member for its grant. That has historically been the way it has been done, and there's, as we all know, a scramble at the end to take care of this applicant and that applicant, and I absolutely agree with what you say, that it first of all, it's better policy and more likely to lead to merit-based allocation, but secondly, I agree with you, I think it would lead to happier lives for council members. That's a case I've been making for a long time and without success. So I don't know who else wants to speak on this. Ms. Navarro, followed by Mr. Katz.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic because I never necessarily felt like I had much say. I mean, the reality is that, the committee takes it up and makes the recommendations, and yes, organizations come and talk to us, but it's not as if it hasn't already gone through this particular, process of selection. It's not like a new organization can just come in and say, oh, I forgot to put my grant and please help us. So I have always felt that the misalignment had to do with the executive grants process and the council grants process. I mean, it's definitely two different situations. A lot less discretion for council members to, come back and say, okay, let's see if we can help this very worthy cause, because at the end of the day, we're just operating on the margins when it comes to the reconciliation list. So I've never felt as if on the council it was super political. I know once upon a time it was, before the shift came up, to be done through to the committee. But if we could achieve a point in time where it could be, I think, one, grants process that is totally depoliticized, that is aligned with our policy areas. I mean, to me, that's what good government should be. And I think for the organizations, it just becomes much more predictable. And it's a much, in my opinion, a fair process. So, that's why I've always been very interested in see how we can align these two. I mean, I remember when I joined the council, it was very confusing to me exactly what this process was really, about. And when organizations would come and ask, I mean, I, spent a lot of time talking to Linda McMillan about this whole entire thing. It was very confusing to have two parallel processes, not just in terms of how it is managed, but also the size of the money that's available. I mean, that's the other issue that I find, talk about inequities. So this effort, I think it's an important one to just kind of align and have it be more, in my opinion, I think that should be the Montgomery County way. It should just be something that is a lot more predictable.
Mr. Katz.
Thank you. I'm in agreement. The fact that the county council has a committee and the county executive does not, in itself allows people, the committee, to hear more for people doing, or organizations doing similar work or the same work, and they can compare. And in many cases, we don't have that. We have an organization come in, and all of them, do fine work, or most of them do the work that we certainly want them to do, but we don't know in comparison to somebody else. I do think that when we revamp this, and I've said this before, I think that the county executive should have some funds that the county executive, I always like to call the Good Deeds Fund, that if somebody comes to the county executive, and that they would have some funds that they could help an organization immediately, if that's what it takes, or it's suggested it helps. And then I've often thought that we should look at whether or not we should set some funds aside for a grants writer for the nonprofit organizations. If we could stretch and I know in some of the smaller organizations, they can't afford a grants writer, but if we could stretch that especially the smaller organizations could get grants beyond Montgomery County, and of course it's a special language in many cases how you get these funds, that if we could have someone who's a contractor, a contract person for the county, but would help all these other organizations, or as many as they could, we could stretch these funds much further, and it would cost us perhaps much less. So I think we should look at all of that.
I guess I want to respond to the suggestion of a good deeds fund. The charter allows the executive to make a request, and 5 council members can appropriate money for pretty much any purpose. And in the course of the last year alone, the council identified an urgent need in the area of positive youth development and an urgent need in the area of assisting residents at risk of deportation. And we provided competitive awards to address those emerging needs that weren't anticipated in the course of the budget. And I think that's fine. I think that's appropriate. I think that's responsive government. I think if you create a new thing, whether you call it a good deeds fund or whatever, you're just replicating the grants process. So that if you depoliticize the grants process and clean it up and make it, antiseptic and have merit review by qualified people as they do in Fairfax, but then you also have a good deeds fund that is established and longstanding, and people can come and petition their elected official for a good deeds grant, you've just created the problem all over again that you just eliminated.
Can I respond to that? I guess I'm not I'm not saying that the county executive would be the only person that would be giving those funds. I don't mean to say it that way. I meant that rather than have all of the funds that the county executive has today, that there be some funds that the county executive would have that they would suggest, and it has to be approved by the county council, just like it is now, all of that. I don't mean to infer that the county executive can write a check and say, here you go. But what I do think is that we shouldn't take all the funds from a county executive, even if we change this grant process, that we shouldn't take all the funds that the county executive might have that they would suggest that they would send to the county council. I mean, that was my thought on this whole thing.
If I'm hearing Mr. Katz correctly, and I acknowledge that I will not be here on the county council to make this happen, but I have been working on this for a long time, and I've got a lot of experience with it. I think that if the grants process is going to be reformed, and if it's going to be spread out over 12 months, as the staff appropriately suggests, and we're not cramming it all into the spring, and that we are identifying particular categories and areas, as you said, in the case of programs that start at the beginning of the school year, you want to give yourself enough time so that the nonprofit service provider knows they'll have it in time for the school year. All of the suggestions that staff has made, I think that entirely supplants a little extra. That you're not also going to have, as we have today at the council, a separate pot of money that we decide on a political basis that we just want to do. I think you're going to have one grants process, and that's how grants are awarded. That does not, I'm repeating myself because it's important, that does not preclude the county government from responding to emerging needs. It does not preclude that. It also doesn't in any way change the fact that the executive can send over anything she or he wants to send over, and 5 council members can vote for anything. We don't have the authority to stop that. But once you set up a framework, the internal pressure and the sort of agreement among colleagues, which is all we're operating in anyway, dictates against that, dictates against discretion and, well, yeah, we have a process here, but, if you come and ask me for a little extra, I'm the executive, I can give it to you. I think the expectation would be that does not occur, that if you are a nonprofit organization, we're laying out guidelines, we're notifying the public that this is how you get a grant. That's how you get a grant. There isn't a side way of getting a grant. You can't go in through the other door and get a good deeds grant. It's either one or the other. It can't be both, because that's what we heard in the feedback from the survey at OLO, was that the grants advisory group members and the nonprofits felt that the extra grants that we give out at the end negate the validity of all their work, because they're trying to assess these things according to criteria. They're trying to assess the capability of the organization. They're making these decisions based on merit, and we accept their recommendations. And then when it's over, we also give grants to whoever we feel like. And that hurt the credibility of the whole effort. And I'd come at this from the experience of the arts and humanities, where, we've had to fight all the time on the issue of earmarks, because I believe that every earmark unravels the big process, because why would the organization take a risk of maybe getting funded through a process that everybody understands? If you have such a good relationship with the county executive, you can just go and get a special grant for you. And that harms the entire process. That's always been my view. And it is based on relationships, and it is based on politics. There's just no question in my mind. Anything further on this?
Just the observation that as you said, if there is any kind of urgent need, a supplemental funding request that is money flowing through a department, essentially, I think, or it could be other ways to do it, is always an option. So
Right.
it's not that the door is closed, it's just that any particular, the process barrier is much higher, so.
Right. But that's different than having a good deeds fund set aside as a separate pool of money that is awarded on a discretionary basis.
Maybe we should, There wasn't a second for the Good Deeds Fund anyway, so.
So there wasn't even a motion. There wasn't even a motion. But my point is, I believe, and you say you don't want to belabor the point, neither do I, but the point is, I believe the county executive should have some some funds somehow that we would still have to approve, that they're not, they would go rather from whatever millions of dollars that they have today to $0. I don't believe that that's the most efficient way to do this. That's my point. I understand your point, but my point is that the county executive should have something, and a some say is to say that this was budgeted from that office, from his office or her office to do this. That's all I'm saying. I'm certainly not making a motion.
Okay, well, we don't have the authority to take the county executive's budget authority away. So the county executive will do what the county executive does, and then it'll come over to the county council, and the county council will either approve it or not, regardless of what guidelines are contained in the resolution or the guidelines that are considered for future discussion. But I do think that the recommendations of this joint committee and the encouragement to pursue even further reform of the process will carry great weight. I think that if a county executive has to put himself or herself in the position of saying, no, I don't agree with what the county council is saying, which Mr. Leggett has already said, but the next county executive, I think, will I think the recommendations of the council will carry a lot of weight. I think that they'll be seriously considered by whoever wins on November 6th. And so I think these recommendations matter a lot. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Erica Lopez, Penn, Office of Management and Budget. I just want to emphasize a couple things. Number one, obviously, I'm not actually the grants person for the Office of Management and Budget. I'm covering for Josh Waters, my coworker. In terms of the review that the executive does, of course, grant applications are reviewed when they are submitted in accordance with the current budget timeline. Those grant reviews are based on, and recommendations are based on the performance metrics and other reporting tools which, nonprofits submit in accordance with their grants. So there are, of course, certain aspects that grant applications are considered against. I just want to point that out. This goes towards your point in terms of the politicalization of the grants process. Any review, as you've said, does need to involve the incoming administration for the county executive. So I just want to emphasize that. Also, I want to emphasize that we have a multi-branch system of government in Montgomery County. So there is what the legislature is able to recommend. There is also, of course, the county executive is able to make his own recommendations, which, of course, the legislature approves. So there is still that degree of independence and autonomy just based on the structure of the government that I wanted to point out. Because, as example, one of the recommendations in the OLO report kind of cites Fairfax as a model, and that's only one branch of government. So that's just a couple things I wanted to emphasize.
No question, all true. And any overall... Any consolidation of the executive and council grants process to a single process, any reform of the process that places it under a single review, either the executive, whoever the next executive is going to go along with that, or he or she is not going to go along with it. I mean, so your points are valid, of course.
And I think for staff, the recommendations of this joint committee to the full council, and then when the full council has its discussion, what we're really looking for is direction from the council as to whether we need to engage the incoming executive staff early because the council has an interest in major reforms for FY21. And I think that really is the key of what we're looking for. When the full, when you make your recommendations and when the full council has a discussion.
And on that point, I'm seeing a nodding of heads from those council members who are not looking at their phones. So do all council members agree?
Even those that are.
Do all council members agree with what Ms. McMillan said? Beautiful. Well, we're making good progress. So I think we should spend a little time on the issue of indirect costs. It was brought to our attention from Nonprofit Montgomery, and I don't know, it's possible that not everyone has read this in detail, but it's before us now, and Nonprofit Montgomery wanted us to bring it up, and I have copies for staff also. And if it's agreeable to the committee, maybe Ms. McDonald could just come up and explain it. She wrote us about it. Is that okay?
Fine with me.
Yeah, sure. Ms. McDonald, why don't you come on up? So if you could, in just a few sentences, if you could hit the highlights of your message to us.
And let me say at the outset, I'm not an expert on indirect costs, but I will say that, oh, sure. So Leslie McDonald from Nonprofit Montgomery. It's a very critical issue for nonprofits, not only because nonprofits need to be able to have their indirect costs covered and so that they can run good organizations, but also there's no consistency in the grants process currently about what level of indirect costs can be charged, if at all. And so that really gets in the way of an apples to apples comparison of similar services. And so what I wanted to do is bring to the attention of the group that the state of Maryland did just pass some legislation which basically says that if you've negotiated an indirect rate with the federal government, that you can use that same rate for any state grant applications. And if you don't have a negotiated rate, then you can use a rate of at least 10%. So that sort of sets a level playing field. When I've talked to other nonprofits about this issue, they definitely reflected that there are times where there's multiple different indirect rates that they're required to use for different grants. And it just becomes an administrative nightmare, and it's not a sensible policy. So I wanted to bring that to your attention as you're talking about indirect costs. It seems like it would make sense to consider what the state of Maryland has put in place and think about using a similar standard.
I'm really glad you brought this up. This is an extremely important issue. And I think it's important with respect to how the Grants Advisory Group makes its recommendations, because it could go in either direction. You could imagine that an organization would understate its overhead in order to get the grant, and the Grants Advisory Group might look favorably on an applicant with very low overhead. And then we've often found in the HHS committee that an organization will come back and say, well, we can't perform this. We can't do it.
Exactly.
We bid on it, we got it, but, frankly, we weren't honest about how much it would cost us to do the work, and so now we can't do it. And now we need an adjustment. And then it isn't put out to bid again. We've been in this situation where it isn't really fair downstream. You had a competitive bidding process. A bidder wins. That bidder comes back and asks for a contract adjustment, whereas had that contract adjustment been anticipated in the initial bid, maybe some other bidder would have been selected. So this is a really, really important topic. Do you, Ms. McDonald, envision guidance on indirect costs in the resolution that goes out to the community on November 14? Are you seeking that?
It seems like that would be a sensible policy, to have some guidance on indirect costs built into the grant application.
Okay. Has staff had a chance to review this email? Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I would just say, we have many organizations that apply for grants that have contracts with the county, and they have negotiated an indirect cost with their county contract. And Ms. Buckland could speak to that from the HHS perspective, but I think when you think about the guidance, organizations can always put in indirect cost, and most do, not all, I will say not all, but most do. And so I think you would have to think through whether you would want the guidance to include that if they have a negotiated indirect cost already with a county, that would be, one of the uses, as opposed to, because frankly, organizations have different indirect costs depending on their funding sources. So if they have negotiated an indirect cost with the county and we're looking at the use of county funds, that seems to me to be an appropriate direction, as opposed to automatically going with a federal government allowance or some allowance they have with something else. So we would just need to think that through.
Ms. Buckland, you're here and you seem to be seeking recognition. Do you want to, the Chief Operating Officer of the HHS Department, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Yes, we do have actually an indirect cost policy that we use at the department. We have a very strong partnership with the nonprofit community. We have a sizable amount of our budget goes out the door to nonprofits in the form of contracts. And we obviously oversee a large volume of the community grants, which also come to us as contracts. We have a strong interest in nonprofits being going concerns. And so we do allow indirect, and not only allow that, we encourage nonprofits to include indirect in their budgets to us, in their contracts. We partner with Nonprofit Montgomery in their FIRM program. Actually, both Leslie and I came from that today to attend this session. And that's explicitly something that we include in that training for nonprofits. One of the things that I have very much appreciated is that council staff and the executive staff, when they do their orientations on the community grants process, they have the sessions out in the community, they often do include us in those because we get such a large volume of them. And we actually do say that in those sessions as well, that from our perspective, this is something HHS does. We do allow indirect, and we do allow them to, we do encourage organizations to include indirect, and that it is allowable to include indirect in their community grant applications. So that is a message that we certainly send as a department.
So what Ms. McDonald is proposing is that there would be a standardization, that organizations applying for grants would know that they're entitled to claim something in indirect costs, and it's not uniform. And so if you've already negotiated something with the federal government, that would be one thing. If you've got something with the county, that would be another thing. Do you have a recommendation on some sort of standard suggestion to the community as to what would be an appropriate thing to claim for indirect
That
costs?
actually is how our indirect cost policy is structured now. We obviously get a large volume of federal dollars, and so if you have, this is a requirement of the federal government, that if you have a federally negotiated rate, that be applicable to federal dollars that you may receive. We then have some standards if this is not federal dollars. We have some standards about what can and cannot be included, and we do actually have a cap on what we allow in the indirect rate to be, which is actually sort of in line with what the county's indirect rate is. So it's a cap of 15% for general fund dollars. And I would certainly be supportive of, I think that having those kind of limits would be in line with the practice that we have already put in place.
Are you comfortable with that, Ms. McDonald?
Yes, and I just wanted to say, we haven't had a full chance to evaluate this within our advocacy process. So I can't say that I have a specific recommendation that's officially on the part of Nonprofit Montgomery. What I wanted to just do is bring it to your
like the issue,
attention.
and
Right.
really appreciate it. It's a very important issue. So Linda and Carolyn, do you think you've gotten guidance that would enable you to add a paragraph to the resolution addressing indirect costs? You could work with Ms. Buckland to draft it.
Well, we can work on it, whether it needs to be in the resolution or whether it can be in the application directions.
Sure.
But we can get
Right.
back to you all with, after discussion of what it would be.
Okay, are committee members comfortable with the way this is going? Any issues or questions or objections? So, yeah, please.
Can I just clarify? So what
Yeah.
you're saying is that you might include in the application what the organizations can apply for, can include indirect costs, but not specifically put a target, right? Because you said that you need to work through that a little bit more. It's not a particular percentage. What is it that you're saying that you're going to include in the application?
The discussion first was whether or not it should be included in the resolution. I don't think it
Right.
should be in the resolution. So it's part of the application instructions. Right now, anybody can apply and include their indirect costs. We have no range, so people apply from 7% to 33%. So we'll work with HHS and figure out what is the appropriate amount that people can claim in their program budget, so it doesn't adversely affect their competitiveness when they
Got it.
apply.
Okay,
And we can bring that information
Yeah,
back
we'll
to
bring
you, but it wouldn't necessarily be in the resolution.
yeah, great.
I agree with that.
Right? Everybody's in agreement. Good, okay, excellent, we're making a lot of progress. So now I'd like to talk about the procurement issue, and maybe Ms. Branson could join us, and perhaps whoever's in the lead here, Carolyn, could you walk us through?
So on page 6 of your memo, there is some information about procurement. And I just want to start by saying we don't have something called a grant, right? We have contracts, and we have competitive contracts, and we have non-competitive contracts. All community grants are non-competitive awards. And what you'll see here is that they can either be executed through a direct purchase or through a non-competitive purchase. So there's no special grant kind of contracting mechanism. Right now, the direct purchase threshold is no greater than $10,000. The Department of Health and I did put regulations in your packet if you want to look at them. The council's had a lot of discussion with procurement and with HHS and DHCA over this. And so procurement and HHS did work together to make a template, to have a pre-approved contract template for community grants that are under $30,000. And that allows standard language, which moves the process along, but it is still a non-competitive contract award. And so I've given you the language around non-competitive contract awards. We have a lot of non-competitive contracts awards that are not community grants. So I want to make that clear as well. When you approve Section G of the operating budget resolution, there's several ways that non-competitive contract awards can be approved. Some are approved through a contract review committee process, but the council can also approve them by resolution if they are recommended by the chief administrative officer. So that's also very important. And so when you approve Section G of the operating budget resolution, the non-competitive awards are a combination of the community grants and other non-competitive awards. And so, for example, in the Department of Corrections, we have a non-competitive award for hospital services because, frankly, we only have one hospital that wishes to provide services. So it's a non-competitive award. That's not a grant, but it falls in the same contracting category in non-competitive awards. Organizations that receive a community grant have to be registered as a vendor, just like any other vendor. They have to meet applicable terms and conditions. And they, and for a first-time community grant, sometimes this can take longer than for those who have gotten them before because they may not have some of those things in place within their own organization that are required related to insurance or other means. So it can be different for somebody who for the first time is being a vendor with the county as opposed to somebody who is a repeat vendor with the county. The payment is another issue that's come up. And so the contract payments, I did put the regulations in the packet for you. We have them in there. And unless otherwise authorized, payments can only be made after the contractor has incurred the cost and submitted an invoice. And certifying whether a payment is due is the responsibility of the using department. You can have an advance payment if the Director of Finance and the Director of Procurement determine that there is a circumstance that makes that in the best interest of the county. So in some instances, I know that advance payments have been made related to community grants, but you need to understand that the procurement law and regulations view advance payments as an unusual circumstance, not a usual circumstance. And that is for accountability for county tax dollars to make sure that we have received the goods and services before we pay for them. And many of the terms and conditions that apply to community grants that apply to all other contracts have to do with also evaluating your risk. And so, and the last thing I'll say, and I'll let Director Branson talk to you about the report that the council has requested that comes in September to talk about what the status is of the contracts that are community grants. But that information, their information's in your packet for you, and I'd let you just comment on those things.
Excuse me. I really don't have a lot to add, excuse me, except there are a few things I'd like to sort of put a finer point on. When it comes to advance payments, yes, there is a mechanism for advance payments. Payments do not come from the procurement office. Payments come from the finance office. Generally what happens is that the using department recommends that an advance payment be made. We determine, we meaning the procurement office, determines whether the vendor is in good standing with the state, thank you, is in good standing with the state and has insurance. And once we've made the determination that they meet those threshold requirements, we forward it to the finance office, and they execute the payment requirement. We don't weigh in, if you will, on the advisability or non-advisability of an advance payment. We just make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Once the using department makes that recommendation, we assume and know that they are subject matter experts, and so we are happy to try and work with them to make it happen. Yes, it is accurate that in this county, there is only one way to get paid, and that is through a contract. And I guess I should point out that if no matter what you call it, in order to get paid, a vendor would have to have, that vendor being a for-profit or not-for-profit, a grant recipient or not a grant recipient, there would have to be an understanding between the vendor and the county about the expectations, about certain requirements such as insurance, and about at least some rudimentary terms and conditions. It is because of that we worked with HHS and a few of the other departments to come up with the letter, what we call the letter contract, which is essentially a template that everybody can fill in and sort of move this process along. But even if you take this out of the procurement office, and I don't, I'm not trying to hold on to it for any particular reason, it should just be noted that some kind of agreement would be necessary. The county, cannot hand out money to anybody without a statement of expectations and without an assurance that, certain things like you're in good standing with the state. And we cannot legally pay anyone who's not in good standing with the state. So, some things would have to be would have to be done, and how they could be simplified. I think we have gone through a great deal of work to try and simplify as much as we possibly can. So I look forward to, to sharing those things with you and answering any of your questions.
So is staff at this time suggesting that we should pursue any changes to what Ms. Branson just described, or are there reforms to the way that money is awarded that you're suggesting? While you're thinking about it, let me just say this. Over the years, all of us I know, and I certainly have as a HHS chairman, heard from individual vendors, or grantees, or I understand it's not a grant, it's a contract, I understand. But over the years, all of us have heard from individual service providers when something goes awry and they're waiting for money and they haven't got it, and they're anecdotal and they're scattered around and they've gone on for years, and somebody is still waiting and it hasn't happened. And so we get the impression as council members that the HHS department is extremely slow in getting these monies out the door, that there's some problem with the procurement process as it relates to HHS. Over many, many years, I've had people, I've been sitting here and they've been sitting there and they roll their eyes and say, well, then you got the HHS procurement issue. And when we discussed this at our last meeting, there was an assurance that that was not a systemic problem, that for the most part, organizations were getting paid timely, and that, individual problems may arise and it may be on the part of the organization who didn't have its documentation together, or, didn't submit the right documentation or whatever it was, but that there is not a systemic problem that requires reform. Does staff have a view at this point as to whether we should reform this process?
So I think we have had discussions for a long time about this. And it's a balance of the speed at which you wish to have contracts or grants, if it becomes something sort of exempt from the procurement law and regulation and ends up in its own category. The question is a balance of risk and accountability versus the efficiency of getting money out the door. We're not a private foundation, right? Foundations can have their own set of accountability. We have, accountability around government. So, for example, not in this exercise, but we have looked at, the range of the size of grants. So for example, like a direct payment right now for all of county government, direct payment is a $10,000 threshold. Could you set up a system, again, outside, but would be like for grant awards of some higher amount? I'm just saying this, like $25,000, right? Could you have something that's closer to a direct pay? I don't know what all the term, I'm not saying a direct pay, I'm just saying closer to a direct pay that would ease administration for the departments and for procurement, and could get money out in a different way, may not have all the same requirements as a non-competitive contract, and could cover, frankly, a large amount of community grants. But I think this is the balance of if the council is concerned that there are enough issues around having community grants, perhaps community grants only of a certain size, right? Perhaps community grants that are over some amount, the council would agree they should go through the full procurement process, no questions asked, but maybe for something smaller, you would like to see if there's a more efficient way that balances risk and accountability. Then that, we could look at that. We don't have any specific recommendations on what it is, and it would take discussion with the county attorney and the procurement and using departments to see what that might be. But, there are potential ways to do that. It's really whether, whether it seems, if you believe that the current system needs some reform, there are potentially ways to do it.
Mr. Rice?
So my question is about whether or not there's inconsistency when it comes to payment of grantees. Are there times in which payments may be a certain time frame, and in others there may be another time frame? This is after they've submitted their invoices, but it just happens to take us longer in processing. So I'm just curious about that, because I think that from what I've heard, part of the question has been the uncertainty of when those payments would get to them. And so I understand the process about invoicing. I understand all of those kinds of things. I understand if they're not in good standing and things may be delayed. But beyond that, from a simple processing perspective, are there differences or are there not? I'm not saying there are. It just seems as though there's angst about that.
Yeah. So if the council required that we do a report every year. And that report states what the timing is, in fact, how long it takes for us meaning the executive branch, to get the request and to turn the request into money, okay? The Office of Procurement is able to track the time it takes when the completed package comes from the using department and gets to us. Okay, so our turnaround time is about 10 days. Okay, so it's 10 days for us. Now, we can't account for what happens before it gets to us, and sometimes there is some misunderstanding, some back and forth. There's workload issues. I think one of the things that was helpful in understanding is that all this stuff happens at the same time, right? The budget, and so for the Office of Procurement, for HHS, we have service contracts that provide continuing services to people in need that expire at the same time. And we absolutely, cannot say, okay, we're going to do that later. No doubt, these grants are incredibly important. They meet they meet some other needs. They help with the social safety net, not belittling or denigrating the importance of these grants at all. However, those contracts that provide the ongoing services are the things that we absolutely have to allow to take priority. And so, when all this stuff comes at the same time, and the law does not allow us to do anything other than, well, we can start work before the new fiscal year, but we can't pull the trigger, if you will, until the beginning of the fiscal year. And so there's that tension, I think, that's sort of built in. The grant seekers, if you will, they've been working on this for a long time. They've filled out the applications, they've gone to the classes, they're waiting, they're thinking that, somebody told them 6 weeks, somebody told them 8 weeks. And so, by May, they're like, okay, why isn't this done yet? I've had people actually call me literally the day after you all voted and ask me how long it's going to be for them to get their money. And I'd explain to them, we got to wait till the new fiscal year. So
on that point, if I may, this is a critically important point. The staff proposal for rolling awards would help a lot.
Yes, which is why I really have to say thank you, Director Branson, for stating that, because I think it's incredibly important. I don't know if we've ever said it that way so that everybody can hear and understand that there are other issues, that staffing issues, right? We went through a recession and we cut positions that I don't think have come back that are helping to do some of this stuff. I'm just keeping it real.
Workflow issues.
No,
Everything
exactly.
falls at the same time.
Absolutely. And so from that perspective, it really speaks to what we were talking about in terms of being able to do this at a different time frame that would allow for that flexibility. Because quite honestly, not all of our fiscal year matches with the grantees in terms of their years. Their budgeting timeframes are different too. So it's not as though it's a plus for them to be on our fiscal year time schedule. It could actually be different, and they would adjust accordingly as well. So I really appreciate that, because again, it's and nobody sought to seek blame from anyone. We just wanted to understand the process and the challenges, and I appreciate you laying that out for us. This is incredibly helpful, so thank you.
So what I'm hearing is that we're not proposing to reform the procurement law at this point, that this is an ongoing conversation for the HHS and GO committees to continue to review, that there's a lot of interest in all of the recommendations from staff, including the recommendation that you don't have to award all of the grants in the spring, that if you moved, not in 20, but in 21, to a process where money was set aside for grants awarded under certain criteria, then those grants could be awarded at different times in the year, and that would help address the problem as we understand it now, right? So that addresses the procurement discussion. Carolyn?
I just wanted to add also that what's happened on the community grants in terms of number of applications, since we don't limit how many times an organization can apply, what the amount is, how many programs they can do, that's proliferated the number of applications that procurement and HHS, which handles 90 of them, have to execute. So the question that's linking back to our recommendations and changing the process completely is really just to remove the bottlenecks, because the number of applications go up every single year. The number of organizations don't necessarily go up as the programs. And with our broadening of our priorities, I can only imagine we're gonna hit over, 500, so, sorry. So just wanted to make that point. It's another reason why we need to discuss 2021.
Mr. Rice?
I think that's a great point, but I also want us to be mindful of the hopeful switch to us doing some base budgeting, which may help with some of that and alleviate some of that workload as well. Although I understand it's still a part of the budget, right? And it's a contract, but if you have the different time frame, right? But it's right. So that, but it's in that context. So we separate the two so that they're not all in this lump with the other ones, but actually can spread them out more evenly that way also. That's, again, a hope.
You do. Mr. Katz, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I agree absolutely. I mean, any of us who remember it, you always had to renew your license plates all the same day. And the literal lines of people, and all they needed to do was go to an extra sticker and say that it's this month or that month, and you know what? We're doing just fine with it. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. We've gotten through almost everything. I have one more question, and if other members have other questions, they can raise them. would it be feasible to go to a 2-year grant award in the FY20 budget process?
So I haven't had a chance to discuss this thoroughly, like with our attorneys and stuff, but I would just say this. You can't bind a future council. So you would have to figure out a way either to, so for example, if you wanted certainty around a 2-year grant, you would have to appropriate the 2 years, I believe, all at once. So if you think about the capital budget, in the capital budget, you have expenditures that are driven by the expenditure schedule, but you actually appropriate, once you're going to go into a construction contract, you appropriate, you give full appropriation, and then there's a plan for how it's expended, but you have to do that full appropriation. So if you were going to have certainty around a 2-year grant, I think that you would, or some lesser amount, you would have to do the full appropriation, and then
And you'd end up- the
and-
result of that would be you give a lot fewer
and
grants.
then the contract could be a longer than 12-month contract, but you would have the appropriation in place for the full contract. You could you have a process by where in your decision-making, you kind of give a priority that you would like something funded for a second year, like you put that in your plan, but it's not certain because you would still have to approve it the next year. You could do that. And so
So the answer to that question, if I may interject, is that the next executive has got to figure out with his or her OMB whether that's something that the next executive wants to implement, because the effect of it would be, because you're appropriating a lump sum of money, even though it's supposed to cover 2 years, and assuming that we're not going to get some huge windfall, that the budget will basically be the same size, that you would end up giving out a lot fewer grants. There would be, each grant would be bigger, but the number would be smaller.
right, so the sort of second example is if you think about how the county negotiates like a lease, we might enter into a 10-year lease, but we have a clause that says it's subject to annual appropriation, and of course, that's, taken into account in the terms.
Okay, but that's a different approach. So
Yes.
what you were saying first was you would appropriate the whole amount.
Guaranteed.
You've committed it, you've tied it up.
Committed
And
it.
so
You're
that-
now entering into a 24-month lease that's fully appropriated.
And it's fully
24-month
appropriated, so it
contract.
comes out of the budget in year 1, even if it's expected to be
Correct.
spent over 24 months.
Correct.
That's
And
one
it's
approach.
encumbered and
Right.
it comes out. And
A
the
second approach is you make a commitment subject to future appropriations. Those are two different approaches.
They are two different
And
appropriations.
ultimately, it seems to me that that's going to depend on what the executive sends over.
I think you
So
would have- yes.
that isn't something we can decide here today, but it's something that the next we can encourage the next executive to consider.
But there are
Right.
definitely, implications into, I know many people have favorably spoken to the idea of a 2-year grant, but I
Okay.
think that the implications, we have to think all the way
So
through.
I think the council and the executive would benefit from input from nonprofit Montgomery on that point. Is, I polled, during the public hearing, I polled every witness on, would you like a single process? Would you like a 2-year process? And most people said they wanted a single process, but some like to have a second bite at the apple. So not every witness said, yes, one process, I don't need to go to the council and then, I don't need to go to the executive and then go to the council. But some people like to have the chance to go to the council if they didn't get. Uniformly, everybody wanted 2-year grant awards, okay? However, I think those respondents to my question did not factor in the fact that we might only give away half as many grants. So it would be really helpful in the next few weeks if the nonprofit community had that conversation, so that when we come back, which we're doing anyway, we're recommending that we come back, once the executive is elected, to have this conversation with the executive to implement for FY20, this question of whether they're 1-year grants or 2-year grants, and either way, how do you proceed? If it's a 2-year grant, do you appropriate the whole thing in a lump sum, which means there's only half as many beneficiaries, or do you take it on faith that we're giving you year 1, it's our intent to give you year 2, but we gotta come back next year for year 2. But even if you do that, that has implications in year 2. You're gonna end up, either way, you're giving out fewer grants. Because if you take the approach that says, we're gonna appropriate the full amount of a 2-year grant now, we won't have enough money to give as many grants as we were giving before. If you take the approach that we're going to give away a lot of grants in year 1 with the expectation that in year 2 we'll renew it subject to appropriations, in year 2, that money's already spoken for and you won't be able to give away as many grants in year 2.
Well, you might have as many, they could.
Well, you'd have as many, but not as,
But they're continuations.
you'd have less people.
They're not new
You
grants.
might not have
You'd have
as
less
many
organizations.
Correct,
new,
correct.
Right, same amount.
Okay?
depending on your pot of money.
Right.
So that's an urgent request, I think, for the nonprofit community to give us guidance on. Yes, do committee members agree?
I agree.
Is there anything else to come before the joint committee at this time?
I just wanted
Yeah.
one more point on that last about the multi-year. It's not necessarily if another option would be alternate years. That's other jurisdictions that I know have done too, of just, it might be less that 1 year, but then you couldn't come back the next year for another program. So you'd have to come on something else. So you could have exactly the same number of grants given, just off years.
Okay, well, this would benefit from further refinement of options and from further input from the nonprofit community real soon. Because I know that at least one of the candidates for executive is really interested in making 2-year grant awards, and if, we don't know who will be elected, but if the next executive wants to implement that for FY20, which is certainly within his or her discretion to request that in his or her budget, a lot of work is going to need to be done right away to identify those options. Please.
Yeah, just
Ms. Branson.
one hopefully helpful suggestion from the contracting world. I mean, we do the contract for a year, and then there's a right of renewal that is held with the county for an additional year. That means that the vendor doesn't have to do anything. Just show us that their insurance and their status with the state is still updated. But at the same time, there's not the expectation built in that they will automatically receive the renewal. So it's a way to sort of split the baby, if you will. There is the likelihood that you will get the renewal if your performance matches up, which is, I think, the other thing about the 2-year cycle
you gotta
that
evaluate.
becomes,
Make sure they're doing what they say they're
right,
doing.
that
Gotta have
becomes,
accountability.
the evaluation may get pushed out a little bit, but I'm not on the programmatic side, but I think that's something, to consider, whereas with the 1 year and then 1 year renewal, and then that's it, or however, you want to structure it, then the evaluation gets pushed up a little bit further, and it may help, with whatever accountability concerns or whatever renewal criteria you want to put in. It's not exactly like putting somebody in the base budget, but it's coming pretty close. So, there you go. That's free. I won't even charge you for that.
Ms. Finn Lopez, did you want to comment?
Well, I was just gonna note, in terms of, as Linda had mentioned, spanning 2 different fiscal years, there would have to be a charter amendment. So it would, again, just take a lot more work on the executive side to
I'm not sure that's right. I follow your point. I understand that the charter requires the executive to submit a budget every year. I've read that, and in prep for this discussion, I really focused on that. But that certainly would not preclude an award of funds, an appropriation of funds for more than 1 year, and I don't think it would preclude, a statement of intent to renew subject to appropriation. So I don't think it does require a
Depends on
charter.
which budget you're speaking about. If you're speaking about the operating budget, which again goes into this conversation we're having about, do you have the grants go through this operating budget process as we have been doing? So that's just something I wanted the committee to consider.
I'm sorry, I don't follow that. I don't think it requires a charter amendment. I'm not in agreement. I've been really thinking about this.
So right now, we only appropriate for 1 year's worth of services.
Yeah.
But it isn't tied necessarily exactly to the fiscal year. Some of the contracts they have 12 months
Yeah.
of funding, and they're a 12-month contract, it's been fully appropriated, but the contract period will cross the fiscal year. The question is, if you appropriated 2 years' worth of funding all at once, fully appropriated, then you would have a 24-month contract crossing fiscal years. I will clarify on that, but I believe that can be done if it's fully appropriated.
Yeah.
Whether you would want to do that or not is
Right.
another question.
Right.
But right now, some of the contracts, which is why actually in the report that comes over on community grants, it always has some that haven't been executed for a variety of reasons. And one reason is that some of the contracts actually aren't due to be renewed on July 1st, and they can wait, right? You prioritize things. So if you have a 12-month contract and the 12 months doesn't end until September or October, then you don't do that one right away, you wait until it's closer. So you can cross, if you have fully appropriated, you can cross the fiscal year if it's encumbered.
And that would not require a charter amendment.
No, you can do that now.
Ms. Novato?
Thank you. Just very quickly on, one of the things that we had discussed was this possibility of just having a consolidated grants process, or just one county grants process. Is that something that we're saying just leave to have a discussion with the new executive? I know that you've included on Circle 8, I guess, an example from Fairfax County. So is that
So
what?
the way, our understanding of how we would write this up for the council discussion is that the joint committee is requesting council staff to engage the new executive staff as soon as possible about how to move forward with the potential, what the options would be, what the structure would be for fiscal '21, and that we would have to come back, obviously, with what the incoming executive's views are on that, and then discuss that with the council.
Right, so
But
I just-
that's your direction.
I just wanted to make sure, because I know this was included in the packet, so I just wanted to clarify that we are not discussing this because you guys are we're gonna wait. Right.
Right.
Okay, so this is just for information.
If the
for
executive
something
doesn't
that's
want to play, it can't happen.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But this is a really good resource. Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything else to come before the joint committee? Any other members have any other questions or comments? All right, meeting adjourned. Thanks, this was great.